I recognize the member for Don Valley West.
Thank you, Speaker. It's an honor to rise this evening on Bill 139, reducing red tape reduction. Overall, this bill it's fairly innocuous. I expect that it's a bill that I will be able to support. A quarter of the schedules, 5 out of 20, relate to term limits on boards. Again, some cleanup to things that I guess the government wants to take action on. So, fair enough. One of the things, though, that strikes me is that the government is opening up the Securities Act here, and that's something that's of real interest to me as a former business person. And I think that there's a real opportunity that's being missed here in this bill. Every province in the country, this government talks about red tape reduction, right? 11 bills and $950 million. I'll talk more about that in a few moments. But, every other province in this country recognizes when a company gets listed on its exchange, it allows that company to list on the province's exchange. So, for example, if a company lists on the TMX, that company is basically allowed to, very, very easily register on the BC Stock Exchange. And that reduces red tape for businesses. It reduces red tape for businesses in Ontario. It reduces red tape for businesses across the country. And that's something that actually does drive productivity, which is, again, something I'm very interested in. Did you know, Madam Speaker, that Ontario is the only province that is not part of a system called the passport system, which allows this co-registration, this harmonization of securities legislation. So it actually is a big burden on other companies who are wanting to list in Ontario, and that brings business here to Ontario. So that would be something that would actually be, meaningful in terms of the markets and allowing companies to reduce the red tape that this government is very excited to talk about. So I would encourage the government to think about that, to think about joining in with the rest of the country. Instead of being an outlier, be a partner and join in harmonizing securities legislation for companies in Ontario and across the country. The Minister of Red Tape Reduction has a disposition to talking about the savings created by these various legislations, $950 million. And I kind of have, said to the minister in the past that, wow, that number just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And yet, Speaker, there's no proof to this number. This is a number that the government estimates, it makes up, it comes up with a few assumptions and extrapolates across a number of businesses. So I would actually invite the government to think about putting their numbers to the test. Let somebody audit their numbers. Let somebody, they like to talk about their clean audit opinions. $950 million is a lot of money. I would love to see a clean audit opinion about $950 million of savings to businesses here in Ontario. I think if we're doing it, that's great, but I think when we talk about accountability and being able to, demonstrate real action, instead of just talking, they should be actually measuring and giving us some evidence on those numbers. The other thing that number says to me is that the government is talking a big game about what these bills are achieving. And again, they might be making some modest improvements, and I will grant that. But in terms of that kind of savings, Speaker, if that were the case, we would actually likely be seeing an increase in GDP growth in Ontario, and yet the latest financial economic outlook shows a decrease. So, again, Speaker, we see some inconsistencies here with, big numbers being thrown around about savings and red tape reduction. I'd like the government to put their money where their mouth is and actually audit those numbers and give us some real evidence that is the case. The rate of bankruptcy of small businesses is going up in Ontario. So again, if these bills are doing so much to help businesses in Ontario be more productive, more efficient, why do we see an increase in bankruptcies in this province? That's data from Stats Canada. The other thing, Speaker, that I think the government should think about is productivity. Productivity is a word that doesn't appear in this legislation. Productivity isn't just about reducing red tape, it's about actually making workers more efficient, making our economy more efficient. And one of the things that, again, I've talked about several times in this House is daycare for families. And while the government is talking now about raising hourly wages for ECE workers, which is commendable, it's very late. We've got families who are waiting for daycare spots, and one of those parents is sitting at home taking care of their child while they wait for a spot to open up. And that's actually hurting the productivity of our province. It's hurting efficiency, and it means that there are less tax revenues coming into the coffers of the province to pay for all of the services that we need. Last night the members across have, the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing in particular, talked about how there were, some of us weren't here last night. Well, let me just tell them where I was. I was at an event in my riding talking about just this, productivity, scalability for businesses in Ontario. We had a speaker, a professor, an economist, talking about what is holding Ontario back from scaling its businesses, what is holding Canada back from scaling its businesses. And Speaker, I can tell you, red tape did not come up once. What did come up is how do we help these businesses commercialize, get bigger faster? And so, Speaker, I would really love to see some focus from this government on helping businesses commercialize. And it was interesting. It was an eye-opening discussion. Dr. Charles Plant was our guest speaker, and he talked about one of the things that Ontario and Canada are not doing is tapping into the marketing and sales experience that we need. So while we talk about innovation and R&D, and those are important factors, that we actually need to be spending time on expanding our ability to market and sell our products. So again, reducing some red tape, that's marginal. That helps. It's what we call helping at the margins. But if you actually want to make a real difference in helping business in Ontario, let's talk about how do we help them scale? How do we help them export to foreign markets, to tap into bigger markets? That really does drive productivity and growth in our economy. Speaker, I'd also just like to talk briefly about some of the other schedules around cleaning up the term limits. Term limits are something that people in governance circles like to talk a lot about. Some people think that term limits should be defined. Should be 8 years. I think is now where we are with the chairs of these various boards being tapped out at about 8 years. And that's probably not a bad thing. That's again, turnover in boards is important. It's part of governance and renewal of an organization. But the quality of the people that you get is also important. And we know that this government has a predilection for appointing their friends to boards, and that might be something that would be really good at helping to streamline and drive improvement in productivity and growth in these organizations. Because instead of having to mollify your friends and make sure that you're doing things that they agree with, you'd actually be getting free thinkers. You'd be getting people who are bringing their expertise, their real valuable, relevant experience to the table, instead of simply appointing your friends or the sister of a developer to a board, when you know that what you're going to get is exactly what you want to hear. And when you only get ideas that are the ones you want to hear, you're not actually going to make a big difference. And so, Speaker, I would argue that again, this bill is something that I will likely be able to vote for. It's somewhat innocuous, but I would really challenge the government to think a little bit bigger, to think about what they can do to actually help Ontario businesses scale, how they can help our Crown corporations here in Ontario actually have board members who are independent, free thinkers, not connected to the Premier or other cabinet ministers, not friends of the government, have wide open, very engaging discussions about the real issues that are facing those institutions. And, again, we've got universities here who are struggling. And having board members who have new ideas, new perspectives, that's positive. And I think the government should take a lesson from that and look at their own institutions where we've got, again, a number of appointees who, there was, of course, several years ago, there was a very big expose in, I think, the Toronto Star about the number of appointees who are connected to the government. So that might be something that would be a really interesting schedule to include in the next red tape reduction bill. How do you make sure that you get independent experts, qualified, relevant, people with relevant experience participating in our organizations. Speaker, I'd also like to just talk a little bit about the Auditor General. You know, we have a new Auditor General that will need to be appointed soon. And again, likewise, we want to make sure that there is independence in that appointment. You know, that's a very important office. That's the kind of office that could audit that number that the Minister of Red Tape Reduction likes to refer to, the $950 million. And we want to make sure that that person is qualified, capable, skilled, and independent. And one of the ways to do that is to make sure that you have people who know that business interview that person. So, you know, open it up. Have people from the auditing profession across the country, across the province, offer some names about who could fill that seat, who would be qualified, and let them participate in the interview. Let them ask questions to probe their level of independence, their level of capability, and make sure that they are people who will be independent and open-minded when they come to looking at the numbers that the government is putting out here around things like the red tape reduction savings. You know, Speaker, I've talked a little bit about shrinking GDP. We've got 0.5% in 2024 as shown in the latest financial economic outlook. I think this bill is the kind of bill where we could talk about how do we make sure that GDP is growing. You know, the government talks about lost jobs in the past, you know, talks about previous governments. Well, when GDP is shrinking, that means lost jobs. So how do we put schedules in this bill that could actually help create new jobs, make sure that those new businesses are successful, thriving, that they are able to scale, commercialize their business? And you know, red tape, like this kind of stuff, is really related to big institutions. We've talked about universities, some of the minor changes in the Securities Act. It's really, again, it's at the margins. So let's actually have some serious conversation about what we can do to drive productivity in our economy, which again is doing things like making sure we have every single daycare spot in this province staffed. That means parents who are waiting to go back to work and earn an income to help support their family and put food on the table and pay the rent or pay the mortgage. They have that income, whether it's a first income or a second income, they have that additional income to help them get through this affordability crisis. That would be something that would be very meaningful to the people of Ontario. So again, Speaker, you know, this is a bill that I think we can all agree, as I say, is at the margins. It does some cleanup. Things that are somewhat innocuous can likely be supported. So I think we've talked about it enough, Speaker. You know, what time is it now? 9:10. Speaker, I think I'd like to move adjournment of this debate.